All right, let's jump in. Um, Thank you so much for joining us. I guess I could have had this screen up the whole time. We'd love to start by introducing the Water Hub for those of you who haven't met us before or joined a training previously. The Water Hub is a program of Climate Nexus, and we are basically a free PR firm for the water movement. And specifically, we work on water equity or justice, and then water resilience, so sort of climate preparedness and adaptation. And the kinds of help that we provide to groups on the ground are things like media relations, messaging, training, and coaching. We have these kinds of workshops every 4 to 8 weeks, and they're always free and open to anyone. We do writing and design, and we also do a fair amount of polling and media analysis. And so if you go to our website, waterhub.org, you can find all of our polls and all of our media audits there in the resources section. And this is us, your two trainers for today. I'm Nicole Lampe. I'm managing director of the Water Hub. And I'm based in Portland, Oregon on Clackamas and Clatsop lands. And I use she, her pronouns. And I have been working in freshwater for a little over 10 years, but have been working on environmental and social justice communications for my entire career, previously having worked on education and public lands and parks equity, as well as ocean stuff. And I will pass it to Bridget.
Hi, everyone. Good morning from the West Coast. My name is Bridget Arndell. I use she, her pronouns. I'm in Tongva territory, which is known as Los Angeles. I'm a communications associate, so I work on a range of things with the Water Hub project, from Twitter management and blogs to social packs. And our most recent project that I worked on was a partner collaboration to create water glossaries for California Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and the Safe and Affordable Funding for Equity and Resilience program. I'll get into those a little bit later, but for now, I'm really excited to chat with you all today.
Thank you, Bridget. So our plan for the hour, I want to share sort of where the idea for this workshop came from, and then we'll get into the why, like why is word choice so important, and how can using simple and clear language actually advance our goals. Then we're going to get into the nitty gritty of like words and phrases that are effective and some that may be off-putting. We're going to do a little interactive exercise there and invite your brainstorm of terms that we all need to come up with substitutes for. And then we will have some time for Q&A at the end. So the idea for this workshop really sparked at the One Water Summit in Milwaukee last month. It's a great event, by the way, for those of you who have not attended. It's hosted by U.S. Water Alliance every year, and it's designed to like facilitate connections across the water movement. And I had the great pleasure at the One Water Summit of having breakfast with a group that we work with pretty closely called the Water Equity and Climate Resilience Caucus. And at breakfast, the co-chair of the caucus, Yasmin Zarapur, asked, what's the root of our water challenges? Like, how do we can't address them if we don't know what's driving them. And this woman, Susana de Anda from Community Water Center, said, the problem is disconnection. We see ourselves as separate from water. And that really resonated for me on like day 2 of this summit, where I had heard people talking about water in both really technical, scientific, sort of sterile language, as well as deeply personal language. And it just brought up for me this like realization that words can either create distance or they can create connection. And that a lot of the language that we use in water actually like saps the emotion out, right? It sanitizes issues that are actually like deeply human, and creates this distance. So for instance, like rivers are something that we all have memory and connection around. But when we talk about them, you know, as acre feet or environmental flows, all of a sudden that like personal connection is washed away. Similarly, you know, safe drinking water is something that is literally essential to life, and that may bring up feelings around, like home or health or family. But when we talk about it in terms of parts per billion or contaminants of concern, water quality compliance, exceedances, impairments, all of a sudden, I don't feel it in my heart. And so what we want to talk about today is how we can make our communications clearer, but also more emotionally resonant. And that clearer part is something that this woman, Alaire Santos, here in Oregon, was talking about. Last year, Alaire and some other groups released this really awesome report called Oregon Water Futures, where they talk to communities of color all across the state about water concerns and solutions. And she told me that in the process of holding these listening sessions, she really had to evolve her questionnaire, because the first questions she asked weren't generating any engagement because they were really technical. And she was reflecting that communities know a ton about water, but that we have to ask the right questions. And that's something that Marcus Hendricks from the University of Maryland was also saying at the One Water Summit, talking about like how, residents are experts. And the number one way to alienate them is to act like you know more than they do about their issues. And so I think bringing this attitude of like humility and connectedness and relatedness to our communications can be super powerful. Susanna, again, from Community Water Center, was sharing, just this one little nugget of an example of why words matter. So Community Water Center, they're organizers, and they often convene residents to talk about what's going on with water safety, what's going on with water bills, what's going on with groundwater and household wells. And they don't call them meetings. They use the Spanish word pláticas, which is a much more casual sort of word than reunión. And they use it because they want it to feel like a gathering of equals, like an invitation to come talk with us, as opposed to being talked at. And I think that's the sort of spirit that we try to bring to our communications. So again, what we want to offer today are tips for using words that are clear and accessible, that are emotionally resonant, and that invite like conversation versus, like people just listening and trying to figure out what the heck we're talking about. And I want to mention that, today we're primarily focused on words. There are a bunch of different units of communications, right? You combine some words and you get a soundbite. We actually did a workshop last fall on sound bites. Sound bites are things like lead is the straw through which our kids are drinking water, or water is basic personal protective equipment. It's like one image, basically. So if you want to practice sound bites or get tips, we have a recording and a blog post about that. Messaging is like the next level up. Messaging is like a complete thought. The formula that we use for messaging, we also have a tip sheet for this and a training, is why does it matter? What's the problem? How do we solve it? How can you be involved? Values, problem, solution, and action. And so if you want to dig into that, we have resources there too. Next up are stories, right? Stories are like how we contextualize the issues and put people in the picture. And then even broader than that are like the shared stories that we tell, like what are the cultural narratives about water? The most basic building block though is words. And so that's where we're going to focus today. And with that, I will pass it over to Bridget to talk about why this matters.
So language helps us tell a story, right? Language and the words that we use when telling a story has the power to educate, to alienate, to inspire action. So when choosing words for your story, meeting people where they're at also matters and is really important. So sharing a story, people can't understand or can't resonate with, it helps no one. It doesn't help your cause. And as water advocates, we don't want that, right? So let's move into the importance of accessibility. Insider lingo, acronyms, and technical terms are just not accessible. If we communicate with this type of language and use those kind of words, it's difficult for people who are impacted by the water challenges we're attempting to communicate to access the clear and timely information that they need to take action. Explaining what things mean in a way that people understand will encourage understanding and allow them to act according to the urgency at hand. So something to think about here is the type of language and words that you use when you're talking to friends and family about, what you do, for example. So an example that we can talk about right now is breaking down technical terms and why it's important. So on the screen, we have a screenshot of a consumer confidence report. This report essentially informs folks, families, and residents about whether their tap water is safe to drink or not. And even though this is supposed to be a guide, it's not very helpful. Like if I were to show my mom this, for example, she would be confused. She would ask me questions like, what, if she could even pronounce arsenic, she would ask what that is, what PPB is, and why does this matter to her? It doesn't look super important and it looks confusing. So it's not clear, yet this is a guide regarding water safety and the potential impacts to her health. So it's really important, but it's not accessible. So this is just important information that should be easy to understand, and that's pretty much what we're getting at here. We may be used to using acronyms and scientific terms in our everyday lives, but most people don't. So we have to break it down and make it as accessible as possible for them. It's our jobs as water advocates pretty much to break down these life and death matters in a simple and easy way to understand, right? So an example of how you can make this guide or this consumer confidence report more accessible is to take one of these contaminants as an example that shows up in tap water and connect it to the health impacts and the dangers if consumed in high numbers to the residents. Connecting it back to their lives and to their health is a way that they can relate to, that will resonate with them and help them understand why this matters. Another example of how we use terms that just aren't accessible is this article headline. It's not very clear what is being said. It might be for us as folks working in the water world on a regular basis, but this is essentially saying that there's hazardous bacteria found in water bodies that people frequent in this area. Yet that's not very clear in the headline, right? So I think this is an opportunity for us to think about the information that we share with media or with reporters, because they're not necessarily the ones writing headlines. But as water advocates, we know what information needs to get across to the public, right? So I think it's important to consider giving reporters, the most important details and the most pressing information in the simplest possible language to help get that message across. So just like a quick example of something that could be more effective is saying something like toxic algae found in Falmouth. I hope I pronounced that right. Warning, water is not safe for swimming or fishing. That's just like straight to the point, letting the public know that this is dangerous and to take caution. Moving into inclusion and why that matters. The way we speak and the words that we use will either create a culture where people feel valued and called in to take action, or the opposite, which is undervalued and excluded. Inclusion will encourage engagement and action, which is what we want, but it does take time for us to understand how to include our target audience. Like, you need to get to know them, to meet them where they're at, so that you can work on messaging that they're going to resonate with. So an example here, or one way that you can do that, is understanding the difference between translating terms and transcreation. So essentially this means transcreation means using culturally relevant information to connect with your audience. And so an example that we have here, there's a picture there of some folks holding up a flyer or a graphic, as well as some reusable bags. So a partner of ours, Azul, created a plastic bag campaign to essentially encourage folks to use reusable bags and stop using plastic bags. And the graphic that they created is a reusable bag that looks like the reusable bags that a lot of folks within the Latinx community already use. So in this graphic, they use a cultural touchstone that folks within the Latinx community can easily and quickly recognize to inspire action. So this strategy that Azul used for their campaign is culturally relevant. It resonated with the community in a way that they could quickly understand. And I think it's important to recognize that they also use something that already exists with their audience. You know, they're not trying to replace something. They're working with something that's already very common that can be quickly recognized, and then that community can amplify it and increase engagement. So just wanted to provide another example of a headline that isn't very effective. So this headline is a little incomprehensible to like everyday residents. I used my mom earlier, I'll use her again. Like, she wouldn't understand what's really being conveyed here. Yet what they're talking about is pretty important. You know, it's affecting the quality of people's lives. So there's several acronyms in here to explain that big dairies are causing more noise and more poop in residential communities, but it's not effective. So this is just another reminder to break away from the acronyms and simplify your language. And, you know, if you need to use more words to get your point across, that's totally okay. And so the next slide is essentially us providing an example of using more words to explain what we're talking about. So I mentioned before that I worked on a water glossaries project, and this is a page from one of those glossaries. This is a page from the SIGMA glossary, which is the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And essentially, we're breaking down complicated terms and even using images to explain these terms and these processes. We made copies of this in English and Spanish, and we made it available online in digital form, as well as a hard copy in print form, to increase our reach and increase our engagement. Because these are resources, the SIGMA and SAFER programs are available resources for California residents to tap into to protect their water supply and even get funding to fix water systems that they rely on that aren't working. But the information is so technical and political, like it's out of reach. It's not accessible for them. So they simply just needed these wonky words to be broken down, the processes explained so that they can get involved. And this is an example of how we've done that. And so I think it's also important to recognize like what made this project so successful is that we partnered with groups on the ground that know these communities that are impacted, that want to get engaged. They're aware of who their audience is and how to meet them where they're at. So that's why we created the print versions as well as the Spanish options, you know, because they knew that community. So we just want to give a quick shout out to the partners we worked with on those glossaries, which is Community Water Center, Self-Help Enterprises, and Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability. We appreciate your collaboration on that project.
Thanks, Bridget. Just quickly a word on feelings before we get in the how-to. You've probably seen this in storytelling workshops. This graphic is from a psychiatrist or psychologist who is talking about how little control our rational mind actually has over our decision making. There are studies that suggest, like MRI brain scans, that suggest that our emotional minds are actually responsible for something like 90% of decision making. And our rational mind is really just like justifying the things that our gut and heart already want to do. And so when we are communicating, we're most effective when we're actually like tapping into those emotions, right? And that is about getting personal. It's about appealing to values. And it's about, again, being clear, because if I'm in my head trying to decipher and decode technical language, then I can't actually access the emotion underneath that technical language. So here's an example. We just celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act, and advocates often say this term, that's one of the goals of the Clean Water Act, is swimmable, fishable, drinkable waterways. I think swimmable, fishable, and drinkable is pretty good language, right? Like those words are all like accessible. But I heard Cheyenne Holiday from Verde in Milwaukee say, what water justice means to me is safe water for kids to play in. And maybe it's just because I'm a mom and my daughter loves splashing around in rivers, but that is much more emotionally resonant for me. And so just this idea of like putting people in the picture and breaking it down even further, I think can often be really powerful. And with that, we're going to talk about like the nitty gritty, like some of the actual terms that we can trade out to get at feelings and accessibility and inclusion.
Yeah, so language that works is language that resonates, right? That people can understand. So we want to encourage you to de-wonk your words for greater understanding. And so this slide is essentially showing a few examples of words that we might use in our everyday water world lingo that aren't necessarily helping get the point across. So for example, we might be using nutrients in our messaging to talk about agricultural runoff or like too much fertilizer entering a local water supply. But when folks that aren't in the water world see or hear nutrients, they might think of vitamins, which that kind of has like a good connotation. It doesn't sound bad to them, and that's not helping get your message across. So what we're really trying to get across here is to keep in mind that the terms that we're using in our day-to-day isn't what we think it means to the average listener. So again, just explain what you mean, use more words if necessary, but keep it simple. And by keeping it simple, we've provided a few examples here of some wonky words that we're used to using, and then some simpler words that we think you could swap in instead. And just to kind of go over a few, potable water just means drinkable, like say that, keep it simple. Stormwater refers to rainwater that's coming off roofs or roads or going down the curb. And you can say that, help paint a picture for your audience to understand what it is that you're talking about. So this is an opportunity for us where we want to collaborate with you all a little bit and brainstorm. We want to talk about some wonky words that you might be using that we can talk about within a group and break it down and create some more simpler swaps for them. So we're going to go into some breakout rooms. So think of some words right now, and then we'll talk about it in our breakout.
Actually, Bridget, I think we did not, and I'm sorry, my bad. I did not enable breakout rooms so why don't we use the chat or the Q&A? And then we would encourage you to, if you already have some great swaps, to drop them in the chat, like, technical terms for which you've come up with great alternatives, and or if you have some technical terms that you would love to brainstorm alternatives for, we are here for that and invite, we're happy to strategize with you, but we also invite other attendees to offer up alternatives. And I'll pop back up that swaps table for inspiration. And I'm already seeing some awesome 100-year floodplain, 1% chance of flooding every year. Yes, aridification, hotter and drier, totally. Thank you. I was on mute. I just saw someone say that they struggle to explain impaired waterways, and Haley popped up and said impaired waterway is Sick Creek. Yes, absolutely. And you can also describe specifically like what's in there that's making it unsafe and for whom is it unsafe, including, is it unsafe for fish and wildlife, or is it specifically for people? Let's see, permeable, spongy, love it. TMDLs, tricky, yes. I've heard TMDLs described as a pollution diet before. I think it could also be a pollution reduction plan. Let's see, what else? Better way to say non-point source. Jessica, I would argue for getting specific, right? To the extent that we can, unless we're talking in a regulatory context. Hopefully we can talk about, are we talking about rain running off roads and roofs? Or are we talking about, fertilizer and manure and pesticides washing off agricultural fields? So just, more words and being really specific. Watershed and drainage. Let's see. Yes, green infrastructure and nature-based solutions from Meredith. Again, that's one that we like to be really specific. So if we're talking in an urban context, I often like to talk about, green roofs and roads and rain gardens. And then if we're talking about, out in wild areas, then we can talk about room for rivers to roam. We can talk about healthy forests. We can talk about wetlands. And I'm seeing lots of good ones. We will, we're going to save this chat and we'll actually populate a Google document with some of the swaps that you all have come up with and some of the areas where you're seeking input, and we'll share that in our follow-up, because I haven't even been able to go through all of this. Are there any you want to call out, Bridget, that are standing out as like particularly good swaps and or ones that we ought to brainstorm together?
I just saw Meredith comment stormwater runoff as water that drains into drains outside a building. I just thought that was great for like really painting the picture. You're explaining where the water is going, and that adds to what we've been saying, which is use more words. It's okay. Paint that picture.
Yeah. Well, and I like porous instead of pervious, because that means something to most people. PFAS from Antoinette, we hear people talk about forever chemicals, but I actually think, and Anita suggested toxic chemicals. I think it's helpful to talk about what they're used for. So non-stick coating, waterproof coating, it's in firefighting foam. Again, just being really specific, and per Shelley, plastics is something that people can wrap their brains around. Let's see, what else? This is great. And I see Stephanie saying that she can't see all the chats. And we will definitely, as I said, we'll create a Google Doc table where you can both see this, you can comment, and hopefully that'll serve as a little extra resource after the event. Pathogens from Catherine. Again, I think getting specific there. Stormwater recharge. Yes, groundwater recharge is also a big thing. Again, my default is to just describe what's happening. So water sinking into the ground for where we can use it for later use. Sustainable yield, Sonia, is one that you will recall we have in our in the groundwater glossary that Bridget worked on. And let me just pop over to the Q&A. Someone asked, I wonder if you could speak to how to use resonant words in a way that does not necessarily sound like advocacy. Those headlines were used as examples from news sources, which are supposed to be objective and unbiased. So I can imagine why they may use less emotional language. Yeah, that is a real challenge. As Bridget noted, journalists often don't write headlines, and we certainly, as communicators, don't get to write headlines. And so you're right. A journalist who's writing about, for instance, a concentrated agricultural feeding operation may not use something like factory farms, because that is, may come off as advocacy language. I have absolutely seen reporters use terms like mega dairy, though. And you're right. The word pollution, I don't know that talking about pollution from dairy is necessarily like unobjective. I have seen journalists writing about CAFOs, for instance, talking about noise concerns, talking about, the smell for neighboring residents. So I think that when we are generating content that's either, I know we have some scientists on the phone, you can describe, hopefully, the impact or the risk or the concern in really simple language without venturing into advocacy territory. And if there's a specific word that you'd like to brainstorm or concept, we're happy to. And Chris just asked, can we talk about when to use research? So yes, we're going to get into that right now. We have some terms that we've tested from polling and examples. So why don't we go there? So this is from Walton Family Foundation poll that was released on World Water Day this year. They tested a bunch of questions around drought concerns nationwide, as well as in Arizona and Colorado. And then they tested a bunch of solutions. And two of the solutions that they tested were ensure sustainable uses of water and practice water conservation, which effectively are the same thing. And, there were 15 percentage points more people that said we should practice water conservation than that we should ensure sustainable uses of water, which, to a water manager, maybe that doesn't exactly look like the same thing. But I think what this reflects is that the idea of water conservation is very familiar. Those of us who live in the West and the Southwest have been, taught since we were kids to turn off the taps when we brush our teeth, and that, every drop counts. And so I think using a familiar term, even if it's not the most precise thing for your specific career or practice, generally will result in higher support and greater understanding. So some swaps, some of these came up already, just about specifics. So these umbrella terms that we often talk about in the West right now, there's a lot of talk about agricultural efficiency. What does that mean? It may mean crop switches. It may mean lining canals to reduce leaks and evaporation, or, using pipes instead of open canals and ditches. When we're talking about water quality violations, what is the specific contaminant? And then as Bridget said earlier, what are the health concerns? And same thing, like when we use these these umbrella terms for people, stakeholders, for instance, or recreational users, tends to be less emotionally resonant than describing the people. And I'm actually going to jump ahead of this because we tested in the Water Hub's June 2022 poll, which was a national voter poll. We tested terms like frontline, disadvantaged, and vulnerable because, they actually have significance right now in the context of Justice 40. Disadvantaged is like a very important term that a lot of advocates are working to redefine at the state level. And when we tested, we asked voters, should these kinds of communities be prioritized? When we asked frontline, disadvantaged, and vulnerable, we got decent support, something in the 40th to 50th percentiles. But when we described what the vulnerability or the impact was, for instance, saying like communities at high risk of fires, heat, and floods, or communities with high rates of asthma and heart disease, it jumped up 8 to 12 percentage points. And so again, unpacking these shorthand terms correlates with greater support, at least from voters, for targeted investments in those communities. And just a note for us, we tend to, at the Water Hub, use terms like water resilience or water equity to describe our work. I probably did that at the very top of the hour. But like, what does that actually mean? It means different things to different people and in different campaigns. But some of the things that have come up in our work are, enough clean water for everyone's needs, healthy rivers and communities, safe water to drink and play in, flood and drought preparedness. So the idea here is just like unpacking those terms. And I want to go back quickly to, visuals came up in the chat, and as well in Bridget's talk as a really useful aid. And so I've used this, for years. This is a graphic from Chesapeake Bay Foundation. And they talk about how a landscape can be a green filter. I've also heard the term green sponge or a gray funnel. And I think that's such a powerful visual that people can immediately relate to, and they know how water behaves in a funnel, and they know how it behaves in a coffee filter or a sponge. So using those familiar metaphors. I see Meredith in the chat asking about resilience. That is another term that came up in those glossaries, which we'll share in our follow-up materials. But I hear Kaylin saying better able to weather shocks to the system. The glossary is not on our website, I don't think. It is posted on some of the partners' websites, but we'll include it in our follow-ups, and we can also post it to our resources section. We're gonna talk a little bit about numbers and social math, and then we'll have more time for Q&A and discussion.
Yeah, so just kind of continuing Nicole's conversation about humanizing what we're talking about. You could do the same thing when it comes to numbers. So humanizing the scale of what you're talking about to increase connection. So Nicole has, I don't know if she said it today, but she's said before to put people in the picture. And I just feel like that's a great way to think about numbers when you're talking about it. How can you include people in the conversation to help them understand? And so going into acre feet or acre foot, this is used commonly in a lot of water conversations when we're talking about supply. But understanding acre foot is a bit of a challenge. So how can you make sense of that or make it easier to understand for folks, right? And so some examples of what you could say are acre foot is the equivalent of a football field covered in 1 foot of water, or it's 16 tennis courts, or an acre foot can supply water for up to 1 to 2 families in a year. So again, we're humanizing it. Instead of saying just an acre foot, we're giving folks a picture to paint or an idea of what that could look like in terms that we understand. So that's the first part of it. Once you're able to break it down, what it could look like, the second part is to explain what some of these big numbers mean when it's getting tossed around in with messaging, right? So an example is from the drought. It's being said that currently 2 to 4 million acre feet of water savings is needed to keep the Colorado River flowing through its dams. So 2 to 4 million acre feet of water savings just sounds like a really big number. It's kind of hard to understand. So again, we're recommending you break it down to a human scale. So 2 to 4 million acre feet is the equivalent to how much Arizona's full share of the Colorado River looks like. Or it's enough, 2 to 4 million acre feet is enough to supply Los Angeles County residents with water for 18 months. Again, we're breaking it down into terms that people could picture, where they can wrap their heads around it. Another example, when it comes to the drought and communicating what that means, it could be hard to explain how much water is missing or what the drought really means, right? But Nicole found this great example. This is an image that NASA has shared, and they're essentially creating a benchmark for us to tap into. So using these images like this to demonstrate how water is changing over time could really help folks understand and create that picture for themselves, because it's an image. But NASA is also saying that with three dry years in a row, this is what it looks like in this particular reservoir. So that's clearly a big amount of water that's missing in that reservoir, because you could see the riverbanks, but it's still kind of unclear. So another way that you could break that down that we've talked about is explaining that the 3 unusually dry years in California from 2012 to 2015 adds up to a whole year of missing rain and snow. So it's like we skipped a whole winter. Like, paint that picture for folks, or imagine going a whole year without seeing rain or without seeing snow. Like, that's a pretty stark image or picture to paint for them. And that could also vary, like, depending on where you live. It could be hard to imagine no rain, or it could be easy to imagine no rain depending on where you're at. But the point here is to make these numbers make sense by painting a picture and humanizing it. One more example that we're going to provide is in terms of how to explain drought. We have an example here of Lake Shasta. The Wall Street Journal recently talked about what Lake Shasta looks like when it's full. So at full capacity, it can hold 4.5 million acre feet of water, which again, it sounds like a lot, but it's not very clear how much water that is, right? So a way that you can humanize it is saying when Lake Shasta is at full capacity, it's enough water to supply 6 million Californians and 15% of the state's farmland with their water supply. When you bring people into the picture, it's a lot easier to understand. So it's like, oh, 4.5 million acre feet of water is not super clear, but saying that's enough water for 6 million people, it's a lot easier to wrap your head around. And the last thing we would like to say about, humanizing words or just or numbers and making your words more accessible is to localize your examples. So right now I gave you 2 examples of drought in California because that resonates with me as a West Coaster. But when you're telling your stories, you want to make your examples more meaningful to your audience. So think about how you can localize it to increase your storytelling, increase your impact. So if there are, farmlands that you could include, wineries or cornfields to reference, if there's lakes or reservoirs or basins that you can use that people are quick to resonate with or understand or see themselves at, that's going to help tell your story in a more impactful way.
Awesome. So just quickly to sum up, and I love the amount of engagement in the chat. The sort of like overarching advice that we have is to keep it simple. That includes avoiding jargon and acronyms, even if it means using more words. Getting specific, so describing what are the risks, what are the impacts, specifically the health impacts, and the actual projects, if you're talking about a solution set like green infrastructure or natural infrastructure. Painting a picture, tapping into memory, localizing, and using social math. With that, I want to turn to the chat and invite other Q&A. And I'm also going to look in, I know we had some questions in the Q&A, starting with Robert asking, has the term environmental justice communities pulled better or resonated more than frontline communities? I don't think that we tested that alternative. Sarah Bucci, my colleague, is here and she may remember and or be able to drop the link to the poll in the chat. I don't know that we've tested it. My guess is, however, that it would not be as meaningful as describing vulnerability to droughts, floods, and fires, for instance, and or health impacts. Just because, the polling that we've seen, and we actually study polls and do polling synthesis. So we did a roundup of about 12 Western water polls this spring and looked at what were the themes that we could pull from it. And one of the themes that we've noticed in polling analysis is that unpacking those shorthand terms almost always correlates to greater voter support. And Sarah dropped that in the chat. Thank you. Let's see, other questions that have come up. We got a question about noting that, yeah, a lot of the examples that were used were urban. Also, admittedly, we're Western folks, and a lot of them were Western. And so Karen asked, how do we customize for rural folks? My response is that the same principles apply, using local references and touch points. But if there are folks on the line who, have a practice of communicating in rural areas and have great examples, we'd love to hear them. I'll also mention that the glossaries, maybe Sarah could drop the glossary links in the chat as well, were designed specifically, the groundwater one, really for rural audiences, because so many of the communities that are experiencing groundwater depletion in California are in the Central Valley. And Sarah, the question that someone asked about was environmental justice. Yeah, and Chris is reflecting that industrial agriculture can be a lightning rod for rural audiences. Indeed. Yes, a negative lightning rod. Agreed. Yeah, I mean, communicating about agricultural issues, I think, is particularly tricky. I'll mention that the Walton poll, which we can also include in the follow-up, asked some questions about, is the amount of water that U.S. agriculture uses appropriate? People typically say yes. We've also polled whether or not farmers and ranchers are trusted as water stewards, and the answer typically is yes. Strong majorities of voters tend to think that farmers are good stewards, and so I think that we understanding that context of public opinion is really important. And then when we're talking about problematic practices, for instance, or changing perverse incentives, it's a little more complicated to talk about the policy, right? But I think this is a place to talk about, get specific about, manure running off fields in winter, for instance, or manure lagoons that are flooding and emptying in storms. So getting really specific. Yes, and Kristen is weighing in that, localize for rural audiences, and descriptions, for instance, about relating to people having asthma. And Heather is saying, yeah, the term climate change doesn't resonate for folks. I heard Rural Community Assistance Partnership talking about that, both on an event we hosted last week as well as at conferences. And they, mentioned that they're working with a lot of mayors and city councils and county commissions that are dealing with climate change impacts, but for whom the word climate change is a no-go. And so, yeah, I think talking about the specific impacts and or the specific solutions, and leaving that super polarizing term to the side can sometimes be the strategy. And Matthew was talking about managed retreat being a huge lightning rod. Yes, actually Anthropocene Alliance did a really cool dialogue on climate migration, in which they asked a bunch of rural and coastal communities to talk about it. I'll be right back. And they specifically, yes, exactly, dog, specifically recommended against the term managed retreat, and had some alternatives in their guide. Bridget, anything else you want to call out from the chat? I've been trying to keep track, but there's a lot happening, and I see we have a Q&A as well.
Yes, from Haley, and when it comes to working with rural farmers, they mentioned that farmers felt hurt by government interference and are wary of looking like they're collaborating with the government. So avoiding words that are commonly used by government officials will be helpful when you're communicating with them.
Awesome. As Haley mentioned, weather weirding has been a safe alternative for climate change. I love that. I mean, we often hear weather whiplash as to describe wild swings of precipitation, but I think weather weirding is even more accessible.
There's another comment from Heather who mentioned that climate change doesn't necessarily resonate with everybody, but being good stewards to the land does. Another, in this context, they're talking about soil health. I think that relates to water issues as well.
Robert asked if there are websites to easily do social math. I feel like I looked this up once before with Pacific Institute and we came up with something. We're going to capture the chat. And so I will include that in our follow-up email, which will probably go out Monday if I'm able to find one. And yes, there will absolutely be a recording. So on Monday, we'll send the recording to the webinar, a link to the slides, some of the sort of like key tips. And that spreadsheet of words and terms and swaps. And I just see Sarah, who's one of our Water Hub colleagues, talking about, knowing your audience. And I would say that, many of you on this call are experts in your target audiences, right? When the Water Hub comes in and partners with a group, we're often looking to you to share, like, what are the local politics? What are people worried about right now? And so, yeah, Sarah is mentioning that, like, going green and sustainable are often triggers in rural areas because they sound like urbanization. So yeah, like, just framing it in terms that reflect the local values. As Bridget said, meeting people where they are is like the number one rule of strategic communications. I see we have a couple more questions. Yes, Haley, we will share the slides, absolutely. And someone asked about resources for words and language to use with elected officials. Well, so I'll just say that, elected officials, for the most part, are dealing with a whole big range of issues, right? Whether you're talking about city council members or mayors or legislators. And so I think actually most of them aren't water experts. And so when we write fact sheets or briefing papers for lobby days, we use the same practices about distilling, keeping it super simple. We often bring up the economic and jobs benefits, for instance, of investing in water, or the costs of water and sanitation gaps. There's some really great research from Dig Deep about the ongoing cost, as well as from US Water Alliance and the American Society for Civil Engineers, about the cost of our water and wastewater challenges. And so I think those kinds of economic arguments can often be really compelling with lawmakers. Awesome. Well, I think we're almost at the hour. So thank you again very much for spending an hour with us, and also for all your engagement in the chat. We're super excited to spend a little bit more time with it, because it seems like there was some great insight in here from peers, and we will be in touch Monday with those promised follow-ups. Thank you all.